You are being watched right now, not by me, not by the government. Well, maybe by the government, but I'm talking about something deeper, something that's been haunting humanity for thousands of years. The simple, primal need to be alone, to have a corner of the world that belongs only to you, a place where nobody judges you, nobody interrupts you, and nobody asks you where you put the scissors. We take this for granted today. We have bedrooms, we have bathrooms with locks, we have noise-canceling headphones, and do not disturb modes. We have the sacred ritual of pretending we're not home when someone rings the doorbell. But here's the question that should have been keeping you up at night, and will now that I've planted the seed. What happened before any of that existed? What happened when you lived in a cave with 30 other people, all of you sleeping on the same floor, sharing the same fire, breathing the same air, and you just needed 5 minutes to yourself? This is the story of privacy before privacy existed. And trust me, it gets weird. Let's start at the very beginning. The beginning of us. Homo sapiens, the species that apparently looked at their surroundings and thought, yes, but what if I could be alone for a bit? For most of human prehistory, roughly 200,000 to 10,000 years ago, our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers. Small, mobile groups of 20 to 50 people, constantly moving across landscapes in search of food, water, and apparently zero personal space. Think about what that actually means for a second. You wake up in the morning surrounded by people. You eat surrounded by people. You argue, you laugh, you cry, you do literally everything, surrounded by the same people. Every single day, for your entire life. There was no concept of going home. There was no apartment to retreat to. There was no door to close. Your life was, by definition, a communal experience from the moment you were born to the moment you died. And archaeologists studying these groups have found something fascinating. They almost never find evidence of individual sleeping quarters. No separated rooms, no partitioned spaces within shelters, just one big shared area where everyone piled in together. So here's the real question. Did these people even want privacy, or is privacy something we invented later, like taxes and passive-aggressive emails? Here's where it gets philosophically interesting. Some anthropologists argue that privacy as a concept is not natural to humans at all, that it's a byproduct of civilization, hierarchy, and the accumulation of property, that before we had things to hide, before we had social status to protect, before we had secrets worth keeping, we simply didn't need to be alone. There's actually pretty compelling evidence for this. Many contemporary hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today, groups in the Amazon, parts of Central Africa, remote corners of Papua New Guinea, have been studied extensively, and what researchers consistently find is that these communities have almost no concept of physical privacy. The Piraha people of the Brazilian Amazon, for instance, traditionally sleep in close groups, conduct almost every activity in communal spaces, and do not have a cultural framework for the idea that some information or behavior should be concealed from the group. It's not that they have no sense of self, it's that the self, for them, is not something that requires a closed door. Now, before you start romanticizing this as some kind of pure, liberated existence, stop. Because the flip side of this is that everything you do is subject to communal judgment, commentary, and unsolicited opinion. You sneeze wrong and everyone has thoughts about it. You're in a bad mood and there is nowhere, literally nowhere on earth you can go to just be in a bad mood by yourself. That sounds like an absolute nightmare. But wait, because even in these early societies, privacy wasn't entirely absent. It just looked completely different from what we know. The first form of human privacy wasn't spatial. It wasn't a room or a wall or a locked box. It was behavioral. Early humans developed something that anthropologists call civil inattention. It's the social agreement, silent and unspoken, to simply not look, to not comment, to pretend you didn't see or hear something even when you clearly did. You see this even today. Two strangers in an elevator. A couple having a quiet argument in a restaurant. Someone crying on the subway. The entire social contract of urban life is built on this invisible agreement. I will act as if I cannot see what I can clearly see, and you will return the favor. This was the original privacy. Not a room, not a wall, a collective decision to mind your own business. And it worked. Mostly, because in small hunter-gatherer groups where survival depended on cooperation and social harmony, breaking this unspoken rule, prying, gossiping maliciously, forcing confrontation, was genuinely dangerous. You could destabilize the group. You could trigger conflict that nobody could afford. Social invisibility was enforced not by law, but by collective survival instinct. So ancient humans had privacy. It just lived in other people's eyes, not in architecture. Then agriculture happened, and everything got complicated. About 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, humans in various parts of the world independently started growing their own food. They stopped moving, they built permanent settlements, and suddenly, for the first time in human history, you had something worth protecting. Your grain stores, your livestock, your land. And the moment you have property, you need privacy. Because privacy, at its core, is about control. Control over your information, your possessions, your body, your decisions. And you can't have control if everyone can walk into your life whenever they want. This is when walls became more than just shelter. This is when the architecture of privacy was born. Archaeological sites from the earliest agricultural settlements, places like Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, dating back around 9,000 years, reveal something remarkable about how people started organizing their lives. These settlements were densely packed, houses built wall to wall, almost no streets, people literally entering their homes through holes in the roof. And yet inside these structures, you start to see something new. Distinct areas, sleeping platforms raised off the ground. Specific zones for cooking, for sleeping, for storage. The interior of the home becoming a structured, intentional space rather than just a place to be out of the rain. People were starting to organize their private lives architecturally. The house was becoming, for the first time, a container for the self. But here's something archaeology rarely puts a spotlight on. Children. In these early agricultural settlements, children had essentially no private life whatsoever. And the interesting thing is, nobody thought that was unusual. Children slept in the same room as parents and siblings. They witnessed the full spectrum of adult life from birth. Arguments, grief, illness, intimacy, all of it played out in front of young eyes with zero filtering. This is not neglect. This is not dysfunction. This is just what life looked like when walls were a recent invention and space was a premium resource. But what's fascinating is that children in these societies developed their private lives differently as a result. Rather than a physical space, they used time. The hours spent alone foraging, tending animals, carrying water. These solitary tasks gave children a form of privacy that the architecture of the home couldn't provide. Movement was freedom. The errand that sent you out of the settlement, even briefly, was a doorway into your own mind. Even today, in communities without the luxury of private rooms, children instinctively find their private spaces in time and motion rather than walls. They climb a tree nobody else climbs. They find a specific rock by a river. They carve a tiny empire out of the landscape that belongs psychologically entirely to them. The human need for private space does not disappear just because no one builds it for you. It finds another shape. Now let's address the thing everyone is thinking about and nobody ever wants to say out loud. Toilets. Or more specifically, the ancient lack thereof. Because if you want to understand ancient privacy, you have to understand that for most of human history, bodily functions were not private at all. And this is not a small footnote in history. This is central to the entire story. In prehistoric societies, elimination happened wherever and whenever nature required it. Communal, or solo, there was no designated private space for it. No etiquette. No door. No awkward small talk while waiting for someone to finish in the bathroom. Even in the great ancient civilizations, the situation was not what we'd hope. The Romans, whose empire produced aqueducts, roads, concrete, and some genuinely impressive legal philosophy, had public latrines called forikae that were essentially long stone benches with holes carved out, set over a running water channel. You sat side by side with strangers. You made conversation. There are actual ancient graffiti and literary references suggesting that people ran into acquaintances, had business meetings, and exchanged gossip at the latrines. The Romans were not embarrassed by this. They were, in fact, somewhat proud of their sanitation infrastructure, which, compared to what came before and what would come after the fall of Rome, they absolutely had a right to be. The wealthy, of course, found ways around the communal bathroom problem, as the wealthy have always done throughout all of history, in every conceivable domain. Private chamber pots, servants to deal with the aftermath, and separate toilet chambers within larger villas. Money has always bought privacy. That relationship is ancient. Speaking of the wealthy, Let's talk about ancient Egypt, because Egypt is where the architecture of private life becomes genuinely fascinating. Egyptian homes for ordinary people were simple mud brick structures, usually 1 or 2 rooms, the whole family living in close proximity. Privacy was, again, largely behavioral. The concept of personal space existed, but the physical space to enact it did not. But in elite households, nobles, priests, high officials, we see something remarkable emerge. Multi-room villas with dedicated bedroom chambers, reception halls separate from private family areas, even evidence of what we might call backstage spaces, areas of the home closed to visitors and guests. This is enormously significant, because it means that by roughly 3000 BCE, some humans had not only developed a concept of private life, but had built entire architectural systems to enforce it. You, as a visitor to an Egyptian noble's home, would be received in specific public rooms. You would never see the family's private quarters. You would never enter the areas reserved for intimate life. Sound familiar? Because this is still exactly how privacy works in formal social contexts today. But here's what's really interesting about ancient Egyptian concepts of privacy. They extended it to the afterlife. The Per Jet, literally house of eternity, was what they called the tomb. The burial chamber, the most intimate space of all, the place where the actual physical body would rest, was designed to be permanently closed, sealed, and private. Forever. The ancient Egyptians wanted privacy so badly, they tried to build it into death itself. Let's shift continents and talk about ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, where the first urban civilizations on Earth emerged. Cities like Uruk, which by 3000 BCE may have housed up to 50,000 people, which is a lot of people for the ancient world. And when you have 50,000 people living in close proximity, privacy becomes a pressing social problem. What we find in Mesopotamian law codes, the most famous being the Code of Hammurabi from around 1754 BCE, is revealing. There are specific laws about property boundaries, about entering someone's home without permission, about the protection of domestic spaces from intrusion. This is genuinely remarkable. The concept of the home as a private, protected space had become so important that it needed to be enshrined in law. Breaking into someone's house, unlawful entry, was already a serious crime nearly 4,000 years ago, and the penalty for housebreaking in Hammurabi's code. You were to be executed at the point of entry. Specifically, they would kill you and bury you in the wall of the house you tried to break into. Nobody was messing around with home invasions in ancient Babylon. Ancient Greece gave us philosophy, democracy, and the Olympic Games. It also gave us one of the most complex and contradictory histories of private life in the ancient world. On one hand, Greek public life was intensely communal. The agora, the central public square, was the heart of civic life. Political debate, commerce, philosophy, socializing. All of it happened in public, in view of everyone. Visibility was status. To be seen in the agora, engaged in public life, was to be a full citizen. On the other hand, the Greek home, the oikos, was fiercely private. And here's where it gets complicated. Who got to experience that privacy depended enormously on who you were. Greek citizen men had both public and private life. They existed in the agora and retreated to the oikos, the best of both worlds. Greek women, particularly in Athens, were expected to remain almost entirely within the domestic sphere. The private home was simultaneously their protection and their prison. They were absent from public life not because they chose privacy, but because privacy was enforced upon them by social norms that equated female visibility with indecency. There was a word in ancient Greek for the private sphere, idion, from which we get the word idiot. Because to the Greeks, someone who only existed in the private sphere and never participated in public life was, frankly, considered a lesser person, a person without full civic existence. Privacy was valued, but too much privacy, enforced isolation, was a form of social death. There's one more ancient culture that deserves attention here, and it's one that rarely gets credit for its sophisticated relationship with private life: ancient China. During the Zhou dynasty and into the Warring States period, roughly 1000 to 200 BCE, Chinese philosophical traditions developed some of the most nuanced thinking about private life that the ancient world produced. Confucianism, which became the dominant social philosophy, was essentially a detailed operating manual for managing the boundary between public roles and private self. The concept of lie, ritual propriety, defined exactly how a person should behave in every public context. How you greeted your superior, how you sat at a formal dinner, how you addressed your father versus your friend versus a stranger. Everything had a prescribed form. Everything was performance, in the most deliberate sense. But Confucianism was also deeply aware that this performance was exhausting, that behind every public role was a private person who needed space to simply be. The private home, in Confucian thought, was where authentic relationship lived. The relationship between husband and wife, between parent and child, these were held to a different standard than public conduct. They were protected from the formality of public life precisely because authenticity requires privacy. This is an extraordinarily modern insight. The idea that you cannot be authentic in public, that performance and authenticity are in fundamental tension, and that private space is where the real human being resides, this is not a 21st century psychological concept. It is a 2,500-year-old Chinese philosophical one. In ancient Rome, things evolved further. The Romans developed an extraordinarily sophisticated relationship with private and public life, one that looks in many ways remarkably modern. Elite Roman homes, the domus, were architecturally designed to manage the boundary between public and private with great precision. The front section of the home, the atrium and tablinum, were semi-public. Clients came here for morning appointments with their patron. Business was conducted, social obligations were performed. You presented your public face to the world here. But further back in the house, past invisible but very real social barriers, were the private quarters. The tricinium for intimate dinner parties, the cubiculum, the bedroom, the hortus, the private garden. These spaces were not for visitors. These spaces were for family, for trusted intimates, for the version of yourself that was not performing for an audience. The Romans even had legal protections for this boundary. Roman law recognized that the home was sacred. Domus sua quique est tutissimum refugium. Every man's home is his safest refuge, a principle that predates English common laws. An Englishman's home is his castle by over 1,000 years. The Romans also struggled, very visibly, with the tension between the surveillance of power and the desire for personal privacy. Emperors had informants. Neighborhoods had watchers. Social life was performance, and performance required an audience. The poet Martial wrote extensively about the frustration of early morning salutatio, the ritual obligation to receive clients and visitors at dawn, when you'd really rather be asleep. Some things about being a public figure have not changed in 2,000 years. But perhaps the most profound and overlooked aspect of ancient private life is the inner dimension. Physical privacy, the closed door, the separate room, is one thing. But what about mental privacy? The private self? The inner life that nobody else can access? This was something ancient humans understood with extraordinary depth. And in some ways, they protected it more vigorously than any wall could. Written journals, private letters, personal prayers addressed only to individual deities. These were ancient technologies of inner privacy. They created a space within language itself, a sealed room inside communication, where the self could be honest in ways that public performance never allowed. The letters of the Roman statesman Cicero to his friend Atticus, letters he explicitly said were not meant for anyone else's eyes, reveal a man who was publicly a titan of rhetoric and confidence, and privately consumed by anxiety, grief, ambition, and self-doubt. The private Cicero and the public Cicero were nearly two different people. This is something deeply human. The gap between who we are in public and who we are in private. The maintenance of a social face and a private face. Ancient humans understood this not as hypocrisy, but as sophistication, as the cost of civilization. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that privacy is not a modern invention. It is a human need. One that has been expressed, negotiated, fought for, architecturally encoded, legally protected, and philosophically debated for as long as humans have been complex enough to have something worth hiding. It tells us that the specific form of privacy has always reflected the social structure around it. Hunter-gatherers had behavioral privacy. Agricultural societies built spatial privacy. Empires created legal privacy. And all of them at every stage had what you might call psychological privacy, the inner life that persists regardless of walls or laws or social surveillance. And it tells us something slightly uncomfortable. Privacy has never been equally distributed. It has always been a luxury. The powerful got more of it. The rich built walls around it. Women were denied it while men claimed it for themselves. Enslaved people had none of it at all. In ancient Rome, enslaved people slept in the rooms where they worked, in the corridors, in spaces without names, perpetually visible, perpetually available, perpetually without the refuge that their enslaver took for granted every single night. Privacy, historically, has not been a right. It has been a privilege. One that had to be fought for, legislated into existence, and is still, in much of the world, not guaranteed. The next time you close your bedroom door, or put on headphones, or simply sit somewhere by yourself for a few minutes, you are participating in one of the oldest human dramas there is. The endless negotiation between the individual and the community, between the self and the world. Ancient humans sat at the edge of their fires, watching the darkness, wanting the same thing you want when you lock the bathroom door and just stand there for an extra 3 minutes doing absolutely nothing. That need is not modern. That need is not Western. That need is not a product of individualism or capitalism or the invention of the single-family home. That need is as old as the first human who looked around at the 29 other people they lived with and thought, I just need a minute.